This is a balance sheet recession, which is very different than a standard recession. People say, well, we had this really bad recession, and after bad recessions, you get above average growth. We're obviously doing things wrong that we got below average growth. Now, they're right, we're doing things wrong, but the analogy is wrong. The balance sheet recession that you have today is a very, very rare phenomenon. It's much more akin to what happened in the 20s and the 1930s. Here's the basic idea. People's houses were going up in value. So people were borrowing money against their houses to buy a bunch of stuff, buy more houses, buy big screen TVs, go on vacation, buy nice cars, whatever it may be. To do these things, they were borrowing money from the banking sector, okay? They were not, by the way, building new factories. This was being used for consumption. And what they were doing was taking demand from the future and pulling it into the present. Think about cash for clunkers. Okay, cash for clunkers, world-class bad idea. But what did we do? We made it worth your while. If you were going to buy a car in the next couple of years, if you didn't buy it during cash for clunkers, well, you were a fool because it was a whole lot cheaper to do it then. But there's only so much demand for cars, all right? So once you bought it with cash for clunkers, you saw a huge spike in auto sales, right? And as soon as it ended, what happened? Auto sales went way below trend because there was only a certain amount of demand for cars. This also is the fallacy behind, well, we had to bail out GM or we'd have lost millions of jobs and the supply chain would have been destroyed. Really? The American public, what would they have done? They would have just walked to work? They would have ridden bicycles? We would have gone back to horses? No. We would have bought cars. They just wouldn't have been GM cars. They'd have been Toyotas or Fords or whatever it may be. And these cars, by the way, are made in the United States. The fact that it says Nissan or Toyota or whatever doesn't change anything. All we did was subsidize inefficient companies that ultimately will fail all over again. But the amount of car buying didn't change. The number of people required to build those cars wouldn't have changed. It was a total fallacy to say that we had to bail these people out. But I digress. All right. Household balance sheets. We run up a whole bunch of debt. Businesses start taking on a lot of debt to be able to increase capacity to satisfy the demand for all the stuff we want to buy. All of a sudden, housing bubble bursts. We can't pay back our debts. These people have too much capacity. They can't pay back their debts. And the banking system around the world has ended up with a huge problem. The simplest way to understand what we face as a world is if you take all the essential assets of the world's banks, kind of the money assets, okay? They're sitting on between $5 and $7 trillion of actual stuff. They have made loans of somewhere between $100 and $120 trillion, largely to people who can't pay them back. All of the efforts of the world are really designed to basically take money from you and me and give it to the banks to keep the big banks from failing. Because the belief is if one of the big banks fail, they're all counterparties to each other's trades and all the banks are going to fail. So what's essentially happening is money is being taken from productive people. It's being given to the banking system to try to keep the music going for as long as possible. But this is why we are seeing such slow growth coming out of this recession, because it's fundamentally different than most recessions. It is, we don't have any collateral left, okay? People don't have, they say, well, the banks aren't lending. Well, nobody's got any equity in their house. Nobody's got any equity in their stock portfolios. What is it they're going to put up for collateral? If I'm a bank and I can build up my cash reserves and I can make 0.25% overnight at the Fed, or I can buy some government bonds that pay me right now, 10 years paying me maybe 2%, and I take no risk, why am I going to loan money to somebody that has no collateral who, one, may not pay me back, and if they don't pay me back, not only do I not get my money, the government's going to yell at me for making a bad loan. I don't see what my incentive is of why I'm going to take that chance, because I get access to essentially unlimited funds. But we'll get into that a little bit more. So, consumers got no debt capacity. Very important idea as well. Back in 1990, somebody has X amount of equity in their house. We're going to index this to 100. And the blue line's the US, the red line is Canada. So we kind of had X amount of equity back in 1990. The average person today, you saw this huge spike, this wealth effect. And again, in Canada, it's still way up here, okay? Wealth effect, now we had all this borrowing, took out all our equity, we spent our seed corn, as it were, and the average person today has the same amount of equity in their house that they had in 1978. For the first time since the 1950s, the average person has less than 6 months of income as equity in their house. Historically, the home was always the store of value. You built up equity over time. Even if it wasn't going up in value, you paid down your mortgage. Instead, what we did is we increased our mortgages by all of these, basically you could borrow more than the value of your house. And even as it went up in value during the bubble, you could continue to take money out. Now all that money has to get paid back. So that store of value, where you went when you had an emergency, kid got sick, you had to send somebody to college, buy a car, lost a job, whatever, all that savings is gone. And all that capacity to borrow is now gone. About 23% of mortgages in this country are still underwater, and that's with interest rates at 3%. When mortgages go up, that's going to get a whole lot worse. If we take a look at non-housing assets, not even considering inflation, I'll get into this later, the average person basically has the same amount of money in their portfolio as they had back in 2000. They have not been able to increase their wealth, and therefore they don't have any collateral to borrow. Business is in the same position. Okay, blue bar is basically business borrowing, red bar, government borrowing. If a business borrows money, one of two things happens. It uses that money efficiently, or it goes out of business. Both are fair. Businesses were doing a lot of borrowing coming into the crisis, using it generally efficiently, and now they are deleveraging. They are not borrowing, they're trying to pay down debt. A lot of the large corporations are borrowing at 1% for the next 30 years. IBM, Walmart, McDonald's. They are protecting themselves, but they're not taking on huge amounts of new debt. You and I can't borrow, businesses aren't borrowing, so Uncle Sam is stepping in. Government borrowing by definition is inefficient. It is taking money from either current taxpayers through taxation or future taxpayers through the taking on of debt. But the money's got to come from somewhere. The government cannot, all they can do is take demand from the future and pull it into the present, okay? Or take money from productive people and give it to their cronies. They can say that, we think that it's better for GM to have your money than you to have your money. We think it's better for Solyndra to have your money than you to have your money. There is nothing that they can create. All they can do is redistribute existing wealth. And they will never distribute it efficiently as the market. Because the market doesn't care who you are, the politician does. Politicians, when they allocate capital, will always allocate it politically. They will give it to their supporters, their contributors, the people that will put them on boards, people that will take them on trips, hire their kids, whatever it may be. But it is ultimately the flaw of government controlling 25% plus of our economy. In fact, you throw in state and local, they control about 40% of our economy, which means that when you and I exchange, okay, we trade with each other. It's voluntary. Unless you benefit and I benefit, there's never going to be a deal. When the government gets involved, it's not voluntary. They can take your money, in fact, through taxes, they do take your money. And then they decide how that money is going to get spent. And they have to believe that they're smarter than you are with how to spend your money, or the system makes no sense. And here's the big secret. They're not smarter. Okay? They can never be smarter than the market. They can never be smarter than you and I deciding voluntarily to exchange with each other. And that is why, as the government spending grows, ultimately we're not going to solve our problem, and we're creating a huge problem down the road, because all this money is going to have to get paid back. The government situation. Okay, I've been using this quote since I first read it, and it basically said, based on various measures, using reasonable assumptions, the federal government's current fiscal policy is unsustainable. Continuing on this imprudent and unsustainable path will gradually erode, if not suddenly damage, our economy, our standard of living, ultimately our domestic tranquility and national security. Now, when I first read this, I focused on the domestic tranquility, national security side. What this person is saying is, if we don't get this under control, we're risking riots in the street. We're risking being able to defend ourselves. Now, you may think that we had no business in Iraq and Afghanistan, and you may think it was real important we did those things. Honest people can disagree. You may think we should be doing something in Syria. You may think that's none of our business. You may think we should do something about Iran. You may think that's none of our business. But again, honest people can disagree. But here's the point. If you really think you should do something about what's happening in Syria or Iran or wherever, North Korea, wherever it may be, but you don't have the money to do it, now you got a real problem. And that's what this person is talking about. Now, this person was a guy named David Walker. David Walker was essentially the head accountant for the United States. He is not a partisan guy. He was put into office by Clinton. He worked through both of George Bush's terms. This comes from the executive summary of the United States budget for 2007. This is an official government document. This is not something, with all due respect, off an Alex Jones website. Okay? The guy who's the head accountant for the United States basically 5 years ago, 6 years ago now, said, if we don't get this under control, we are headed for very, very real problems. The question becomes, have we gotten this under control? And of course the answer is no. If we look at this, when he wrote this, it was the end of 2006. We basically had about, $8–9 trillion in debt. That number now is over $16 trillion, okay? So what we have done is government has significantly stepped up its increase in borrowing to try to offset the fact that you and I don't have any collateral to borrow. And that takes us to the world famous debt clock. Now this is the debt clock as of January 2nd of 2013. A couple of ideas. We have spent and borrowed $16.3 trillion. The debt ceiling was right around 16.4, and this is where we hit the debt ceiling. The gross domestic product, everything we produce, was about $15.5 trillion. All right? Now, an important idea. Gross domestic product growth is not necessarily a good thing. It depends if it's all being done with borrowed money, if it's all taking demand from the future, it's not necessarily a positive. But I'm going to tell you in general, we are over 100% of debt to GDP. What does this mean? There's some research out there that essentially shows, and stay with me, if your debt to GDP is below 30%, this is kind of how fast your country grows. Your average growth, your median growth. If your debt is 30 to 60%, you're still doing okay. 60 to 90, you're doing okay. You get above 90%, you actually have significant decreases in growth. The reason that the hypothesis, they say they don't really know why this is, but it's you get to a point where people just won't lend you money anymore. And when you got to start paying the money back that you've already borrowed, that takes down your growth significantly. See, with the sequestration debate that's going on right now, everyone's saying if we cut the budget by $85 billion, the world's going to come to an end because we're going to lose all these jobs and all the rest of it. The reality is that's going to happen someday. Okay? And if you tell me that the only place we can cut is we're going to cut first responders and Department of Health and Human Services and National Institute of Health and all this stuff, instead of cutting stupid stuff that we do as a country, I'm going to say you're dishonest. And we unfortunately, as a people and as a government, have become dishonest. There's something called the Washington Monument Effect. Whenever the government needs more money, what they do is they shut down the stuff that's most visible to you. They fire the teachers. They fire the police officers, or at least they tell you that's what they're going to do. They close the Washington Monument. They close Yellowstone because everyone goes, holy cow, we can't close Yellowstone. We can't close the Washington Monument. We can't fire the school marm. Okay, so we got to give these guys more money. Okay, what they never cut is all the ridiculous things that they do, whether it's building rainforests in Iowa or giving money to Solyndra or whatever. And there's actually a dozen of these green energy companies that have gone under with literally billions of dollars of urinized money. That's not what gets cut. Okay? What gets cut is the stuff that hurts you the most because that's going to get you to give them more money. But ultimately, it always fails. So we come back to the debt clock. We're over 100% of debt to GDP. We're already in bad situations. We spend $3.5 trillion a year. We bring in $2.4 trillion a year. So every year this number goes up by just over $1 trillion. Under the best case scenario, people get serious about the debt and deficit, this number is still going to be $24 trillion in 10 years. Okay? We're still adding debt at a significant rate every year. We spend $266 billion a year on interest on the debt. And that is because we can borrow money effectively for free. We get money for about 2%. And I don't want to get too arcane on this, but we get most of that money kicked back to us through the Federal Reserve anyway. I'll talk about that later. If 10-year treasuries go back to their long-term average, their 30-year average, where we have to pay 6.7% to borrow instead of 1 to 2%, this number is going to approach $1 trillion. And the question is, where's that money going to come from? Okay? You can't get it out of taxes. We just had this fiscal cliff deal that supposedly is going to bring in $60 billion a year, which, by the way, it won't, but let's assume it does. First of all, they already blew the first year of it by giving $60 billion for Hurricane Sandy victims. But again, look, you can make a reasonable argument that we should not give these people money because they shouldn't be living in areas that are subject to hurricanes and floods. It's creating moral hazard, all that stuff. That's one separate argument. But even if you say, hey, we got to help these people, most of the money isn't going to these people. There's money in the Hurricane Sandy relief that's going for Alaskan fisheries. Explain to me how that really works. There's money going to things, half the money in this emergency appropriation, no hearings, no discussion, half the money won't even be spent this year. How is that emergency money? But again, whenever, as they say, never let a crisis go to waste. Whenever they have these emergencies, it's a way of sucking money out of the American public. The entire first year of tax increases that's going to fix our spending problem, all's been spent already just on the Hurricane Sandy deal. And if you think we're not going to see more of that, I think unfortunately you are mistaken. So you can't get out of taxes and nobody's going to cut spending. So all that's going to happen is our debt is going to start to spiral out of control. It will keep getting added onto the debt faster and faster. You and I also are in the hole for 100% of GDP, most of which is in mortgages, many of which are still underwater, even with 3% interest rates, and about $1 trillion of it now is in student loan debt. 11% of student loans are currently in default. If you take all the ones that are being deferred, which is about half of them, and don't worry about the detail, but basically the assumption is about 20% of these things aren't going to get paid back. The U.S. taxpayer is now on the hook for these. We are underwriting 93% of all student loans to essentially fund college educations, which are not going to return the value for the cost that's being invested. We are taking our young people and we are creating this huge debt burden on them, giving them a subpar education where they're not going to get a return on investment, and then ultimately sticking you and I with the bill. This is a system that isn't working for anybody except the folks in the colleges. Whole different discussion, incredibly wasteful. But it's the danger of the government getting involved. But we need young people to go to college. Well, the more money you throw into the system, the higher tuition's going to be. Okay? It's not like the colleges, if all of a sudden, look, if you're applying to college and you can afford $5 grand, college is going to find a way to charge you $5 grand. Okay? If all of a sudden the government steps in and says, we'll pick up the $5 grand, well, you still got $5 grand. The college is going to find a way to get 10 grand out of you. Okay? That's exactly what has been happening. The more we get involved in these systems, the more inefficient we make them, because again, the market will make a better decision than if we let the government get involved. All right. All this stuff's bad. None of this stuff's the problem. Here's the problem. We have promised people $16 trillion in Social Security benefits that we don't have the money for. We have promised them $21 trillion in prescription drug benefits we don't have the money for. And we have promised them $85 trillion, trillion with a T, in Medicare benefits that we don't have the money for. These three items alone is $122 trillion in promises we have made to the American people that we cannot afford. This number does not include government pensions, Fannie, Freddie, all the rest of it. You add everything up, the best number out there is that we owe about $220 trillion in promises and debt that we don't possibly have the money to pay back. The entire world economy is about 60-some trillion dollars. We are bankrupt. These programs are bankrupt. We can keep the music going for a number of years. We can probably keep it going for 10, maybe even 15 years. But when the music stops, it's going to get really, really ugly. So let's take a look at this in terms, again, trillions is a hard number, at least for me to understand. If this is your household budget, you make $50,000 a year, you spend $82,000 a year, and you've promised people you're going to pay them about $4 million bucks. What are the chances you are good for this $4 million? I will argue it's really small, okay? But that is our budget and our expenses in this country. Now, the sequestration debate that's going on right now as we're doing this will cut this spending by the equivalent of 2,600 bucks. But it doesn't really. All it does is it slows the rate of growth. We will still spend more money with sequestration in 2013 than we spent in 2012. The $82,000 is continuing to go up. This number goes up every year. We actually, our unfunded liabilities go up by about $10 trillion a year, which is about 70-some% of gross domestic product. We are in an area where, and here's the thing, there's no good solution to this. You'd have to cut spending, cut government by about 40-some%. And no one is going to propose that because that person will never get elected. Even if you vote for Ron Paul, okay, he can't get this done because he couldn't get it through Congress. And if you could miraculously get it through Congress, you couldn't get it through the bureaucracy. You couldn't get it through all the lobbyists, the rest of it. Why do you care? The reason I think you should care about this is we are bankrupt and it's an unsolvable problem. Everything they do is going to be window dressing. Ultimately, this is going to come to a very bad end. And you can be prepared or you can be unprepared. If you are prepared, you can not only come out of this okay, you can actually come out of this very, very well. You can not just survive but thrive during this time. The vast majority of people are going to get beaten like rented mules. That is the saddest thing about this. This is why I say to people, I would not bet on Medicare and Social Security more than about 10 years from now. And without Social Security, over half the people in this country over 65 will live in poverty. And the reality is we will not make these decisions. The people, when we ultimately have to go to other people for money, and here's some simple math, I'll get into this later. We need to bring in $10 to $12 trillion in new debt over the next 5 years. No one has it. Okay? The Federal Reserve will not be able to create that much money. We will get some of that money probably from China, but then China will make the decisions about when we retire, who gets Social Security benefits. This is exactly what's happening in Europe right now. People say, well, we're bailing out the people of Greece. Why are they all rioting in the streets? Well, they're rioting because they're not getting bailed out. The French banks that own the Greek debt, those are the people getting bailed out. The average person in Greece is getting screwed in this deal. Okay? All the stuff they've been promised, all the retirement, all the benefits. Now, you can argue the retirement benefits were ridiculous, and that's fair, but that was the deal. Everything they've been promised, they're not going to get. And the same thing's going to happen here. When all of a sudden our retirement age isn't going to go to 70, okay, our retirement age is going to go more like to 80, all right? And I will explain why later. But we won't be in charge of that. What people are going to say is, hey, you want the money, here's the deal. And we will have to take the money or default or essentially cease to exist as a country. And all of those, by the way, are possibilities. But it's why just being in dollars is going to be a very, very dangerous place to be. And here's one other thought. The only way you can keep this going for about 10 years is if you think about where is their real cash without having to create more of it. Where is it right now? It's in government-sponsored retirement accounts. There's about $8 trillion in IRAs and 401ks. In some countries, the governments have just seized them. Okay, it happened in Argentina, it happened in Belgium. There's like 6 countries that did that. Some countries, they just tax them to death when you take the money out if you're at the high end of the income scale. For a long time, I fought the idea that the government would seize our accounts, and I don't think they will. I think people probably would riot at that point. But you don't have to do that. There will be a big stock market correction at some point. And I'm talking about, 30, 40, 50%, kind of stuff like we saw in 2008, and maybe significantly worse. When that happens, politicians are going to come on TV, and they're going to look you in the eye and say, Wall Street is a rigged game. These people are nothing but a bunch of liars and cheats. It's not right for you to have your money in there because these guys are sharks and they're going to take your money. Which, by the way, if you don't know what you're doing, is absolutely true. Okay, and it's why we believe education is so important in this system. All right, but they're going to then say one of two things. Either the only thing that's safe for you to put your money in is U.S. Treasuries, because the U.S. government's never going to default, and they're going to force you to put all your retirement money into Treasuries. Or they can simply come out and say, you know what, you can put your money anything you want, but if you put it in U.S. Treasuries, when you take it out, it's all tax-free. There's about $8 trillion in these government-sponsored retirement accounts, and they're going to get a big chunk of it. There's also a move afoot to expand basically your forced retirement savings. Tom Harkin has a bill in front of Congress where you would have to put in 4% of your wages, 4% of your income into a retirement account. Your employer would have to match it with 4%. So now you're getting another 8% of all the payroll in this country put into a trust, which would then be administered by a trustee who would decide what it gets invested in. And you know what a lot of it's going to get invested in? U.S. Treasuries. And this is a way that they continue to bleed money out of you, use it for whatever purposes they want so they don't have to pay the piper. Social Security effectively has been, and you can argue it's been a good system, with all due respect, you're wrong. Okay? It's a Ponzi scheme. All the money that came in, there were $2.7 trillion that came into Social Security that were not paid out in benefits. The money's all been spent. The government has spent that money on their, quite frankly, stupid projects over the years, and that money is gone. What Social Security really was a way to separate you from more of your hard-earned money. This new retirement program, if it comes about, it's going to be exactly the same. They can dress this up. They can make it sound good. But the minute they decide what's right for your money, instead of you making the decision, you are at risk. And that is one of the roads I think, unfortunately, we're going to go down. Now, stay with me, folks. This is all going to tie together, but I want you to understand kind of where we're at. This is a forecast. This is the debt clock, January 2nd of 2017, assuming that everything continues on its current path. So this assumes that you're going to have the sequestration. By the way, this assumed that the Bush tax cuts were going to continue weren't going to continue for anybody. Okay? And about 70% of the Bush tax cuts, by the way, went to people at the low end of the income scale. That's a whole other argument. But with the path we're on right now, they're saying not in 10 years, but in 4 years, we're going to be in the hole $22 trillion. Our whole economy will be about $17 trillion. So now we're at about 140% of debt to GDP. We are now going to have $150 trillion in unfunded liabilities without counting the pensions, all the rest of it. This number is going to be about $250 trillion all up. The reality is it doesn't matter. Okay, whether it's 100 trillion or 200 trillion is immaterial. I actually read something that said that once we basically went into debt $1 trillion, we were done, because we were never going to be able to save $1 trillion. We certainly aren't going to be able to save a couple hundred trillion. Why is this important? A few reasons. One, a bunch of people in this country are counting on the government being there to bail them out. Social Security, Medicare, prescription drugs, unemployment, welfare, food stamps, all that kind of stuff. They're counting on that money. Honest, hard-working people who played the game by the rules are going to have the rules changed on them in mid-game. And they're not going to be happy people, and it's not going to be fair, it's not going to be right. The reality is there isn't any money. And that is going to come, again, not in the next 5 minutes or 5 months, but certainly in the next 5, 10, and 15 years, you can see that start to happen. I used to think that if people were in their 60s, they would be able to get their benefits. I now think, again, if you're trying to get benefits at 10 to 15 years from now, the chance that you're going to get what you think you're going to get, pretty small. And here's the other problem. If what you do is protect the elderly, because that was the deal that they signed up for, all you're doing is putting more of a burden on the children, the grandchildren. Those are the people who will really suffer. This whole Greenspan Commission that fixed Social Security back in the 1980s, basically they did it on the backs of the young. Okay, and that, when you couple that with the fact we're piling on this college debt on them, you're making it impossible for them to find work because of the minimum wage and things we'll get into in a little bit. You're fundamentally changing the nature of this society to a government-centric system. And if you're relying on that government, I think you're going to get real disappointed. And it's why, again, I say it is so important. I think the most important skill anybody can have is really understanding how the markets work, how to protect yourself when the dollar loses significant value, how to use other currencies, how to use options, how to use futures. That is going to be key to success, because no matter what the economy does, there's ways of making money. There's ways of protecting money. The average person who sits back and thinks, well, everything's just kind of hunky-dory and the stock market's going up, that person's going to unfortunately find themselves, I think, in a lot of trouble. There's an issue of demographics, and I just want to highlight a couple ideas here. As we age as a society, all of these problems I've outlined are going to become significantly worse. 10 years ago, for every one person entering retirement, 10 people entered the workforce. In March of 2012, for the first time, that ratio became 1 to 1. Within 10 years, for every 10 people entering retirement, one person will enter the workforce, provided that one person can find a job. This is unsustainable. Had you not looted Social Security, had you not come up with a series of really stupid decisions on what you fund and don't fund in Medicare, had you allowed the free market to manage the healthcare system, you would be in better shape than you are. But you are fundamentally in unsustainable shape. As we get older, our medical costs go up, and people as they get older also purchase things differently. They don't tend to buy as many stocks. Okay? They tend to be selling stocks to pay for their retirement. All stock prices are determined by supply and demand. As we get older, if we don't keep buying stocks, you got to realize you got to be able to play the downside of this. And they also don't buy as much other stuff. A lot of people in their 70s and 80s are not out buying 7,000 square foot McMansions with granite countertops. Okay? All of those houses that were built, okay, part of what fed the bubble as well was the fact that the baby boomers were in their prime consumption ages in the 1990s. That was the age where they had good incomes, they had bubbles, and they bought a lot of stuff because they were raising children and the rest of it. As we age, as a society, we're not going to buy things the same way. And that will ultimately have an impact on the economy. Plus the fact that we have sucked all this demand from the future that eventually we have to pay back. Fundamentally, demand is going to be lower going forward than it otherwise would be. This is a real issue. So, how could we fix all this? Now, prepare just to get really, really angry, okay? Because a lot of you are not going to like this. But here's how you could really fix this, okay? The first thing is, you've got to increase the number of people pulling the cart instead of the number of people who are in the cart. Okay. Right now, I think the latest Gallup poll showed that of people over 18 years old in this country, 43.4% of them are actually working full-time. That means about 57% of the people are effectively in the cart being pulled. Do not misunderstand. I'm not saying that wasn't the deal. You're over 65, you're retired, you're retired military, whatever. That was the deal. I get that. But math is math. And if the math is out of every 10 people, 6 of them are being supported by the other 4, those 4 people are really going to have problems supporting those other 6, or those 6 people aren't going to have very good lives. And the way we're keeping it going now is the government is continuing to borrow on our behalf to support a fundamentally flawed system. So how can you do it? Well, you can reduce the cost of labor. That's one thing that you can do. How do you do that? Get rid of the minimum wage. Oh, it's an outrage. Okay, first of all, understand people don't live on the minimum wage. Something like the average wage of someone, if someone's earning the minimum wage, the average wage of their household is $40-some thousand a year. The minimum wage is not designed to support a family. That's not the point. But here's the thing. I own a business, okay? I cannot hire you if you do not create more value than what it costs me to pay you. And it costs me, now right now it's $7-some an hour, which is ridiculous. They want to take it to $9. But it's not just $9. I got to pay the Social Security, I got to pay the health insurance, I got to pay a whole bunch of other stuff. My effective cost of hiring someone with a minimum wage of $9 is probably somewhere close to, if I do some quick math, it's probably going to be $12-13 an hour. Well, Ken, that's, why is that bad? Well, because I can't hire you if you can't deliver more value than that. And in fact, I've got to be able to make a profit on you. And if you say, let's say I want my labor cost, depending on my business, to be about 1/3, okay? You've got to then be able to produce about $30-some to $40-some in value per hour. Now, if you can do that, that's great, but then I'm going to pay you more. Because by the way, if people got paid only the minimum wage, everybody in this country right now would make 7-something an hour. The reason you get paid more than that is because your skills are greater than that, and there's a competition for labor. Now, granted, there's not as much competition as we'd like, but it is what it is. Here's the problem. If you have someone who is low skilled, they're not going to produce $45 an hour worth of value. That person will never get their first job. The fact that they got a lousy education growing up will haunt them the rest of their lives. The fact that they didn't learn basic job skills like showing up to work on time, all the rest of the basics, good attitude, the rest of it, those people never get on the first rung of the ladder. The reason countries in Europe have so much youth unemployment, and the reason we're headed that way in this country as well, is if I got to hire somebody and pay them $9 an hour, it's not that I won't hire someone, but I'm not hiring a kid who's 16. I'm going to hire somebody in their late 20s, okay? I'm going to hire somebody who already got on the ladder. And so the people down below are never getting on that ladder, and they will become permanently unemployed or underemployed. This is a travesty. Minimum wages, a lot of the reason that it was established was to basically protect unions. And quite frankly, it was designed to, I'll say it this way, protect white people, okay? That's a big part of why the minimum wage was created, was they didn't want people who were willing to work for less taking white people's jobs. That was a big part of it. And that, I think, is just horrible. I mean, when you really think about the implications and what we're doing, we wonder, why is there such high minority unemployment in this country? Well, because a lot of them had lousy educations, which they couldn't really control, but we never allowed them to get the on-the-job training and move up the ladder. And I know that's not making a lot of you happy, but that's reality, okay? Get rid of the corporate income tax. Corporations don't pay taxes anyway, okay? Why taxes? And first thing is, you get rid of a lot of corruption, because large corporations literally don't pay taxes. GE made, and this number's now a couple years old, they made $5 billion in the United States. They made $9 billion worldwide, and they got money back. They got back $360-some million. Facebook just got back something like $500 million, okay, even though the company made like $1 billion, okay, because they know how to game the system. General Electric has 2,000 people working in their tax department writing our tax laws. They have people who used to work in the Treasury Department, people work for the IRS, lobbying for them, writing the tax laws. You're making it impossible for the small and mid-sized business who actually has to pay taxes because they don't have any lobbyists. You're making it impossible for them to compete. It's crony socialism, and that is what we are unfortunately creating in this country. Get rid of this. You've lowered the cost of labor. People will hire more people. It's as simple as that. You hire more people, they pay taxes, everybody wins. By the way, we should expand the amount of people who pay taxes too. Maximum of 6 months of unemployment. Oh, Ken, that's not fair to people who are unemployed. Let me tell you, I've been a guy who's been unemployed in my earlier days, right? It is amazing how when your unemployment runs out, you find a job pretty close to that, okay? It's reality. Now, it may be that you don't want to take the job, but it's not like there are no jobs available. Let me put it this way, people don't just stay on unemployment. If you made $1 million a year on unemployment, would you work? I wouldn't, okay? How about 100,000? Probably not, okay? All it is what's the price point. And if we make it, there are some people who basically, if you give them 20, 30 grand, you get some food stamps, you get this, whatever. I think the average benefits package you kind of pull now is 30-some grand a year. Why on earth would you go work for 50 grand a year if you can get 30 grand and you get all your time to yourself? Do a little work on the side, make a few bucks there. This is something that is not helping us, plus it's putting too many people in the cart. We've got to move healthcare and education to free markets, all right? Essentially, all right, everybody knows we need more health insurance in this country, right? No, you need less health insurance in this country. If you've got homeowners insurance, it doesn't pay you when you got to buy a new couch. It doesn't pay you to paint your house. It pays you when there's a catastrophic event. When you have car insurance, it doesn't pay you to put gas in your car. It doesn't pay for your tune-ups. It doesn't pay for new tires. It pays for you have an accident. Why do we have health insurance that pays for you to go to the doctor? Well, it's cheaper in the long run. No, it's not, okay? Because if you had to pay to go to the doctor, you'd care what it costs to go to the doctor. Doctors would then have to compete on price. Most of us don't even know what it costs to go to the doctor because somebody else is paying the bill. There should be health insurance for people that have catastrophic events. But most health insurance, all it does is drive up the cost of the system. Okay, and that sounds great in theory. Okay, no, here's the reality. What is the one area of healthcare where costs come down? Cosmetic surgery, okay? You look at laser surgery for eye surgery, you look at cosmetic surgery of whatever you want to imagine out there. The prices for that come down because you have to pay the bill, because you care what it costs and people have to compete on price. None of those things are covered by insurance. If you want to lower the cost of health care, you got to get government out of the business of health care. One of the worst things we ever did was the Affordable Care Act. Education. The more money we pile into education, the schools don't get any better. We just become more and more inefficient, and we increase the power of these people to continue. Look, I don't want to go in Dennis Miller fashion, I don't want to go on a rant here, but you've got to have competition in education. You've got to get government out of the education business. Until you do that, schools aren't going to get any better. It's a simple fact, our schools have failed. And if we're not willing to do something different, we have no chance of success. And as I think it was Randy Weingartner, who's the head of one of the teachers' unions, put it, as soon as students pay union dues, I'll care about students. Okay, and that's a paraphrase of something she said. The unions exist to protect the teachers, not the students, and it's one of the greatest crimes that we have in this country. All right, what is the other thing? We can increase the number of workers. How do we do this? We have more people paying into the system. Raise your retirement age to 75. Oh, Ken, that's just a horrible idea. Okay, well, let's think this through. When Social Security started in 1935, most people working were men. The average male died at 59.7 years. Now, those are the ones that were born in 1935. In 1935, the average lifespan was actually high 40s, low 50s of people that were kind of born 50 years earlier. Women were living to just over 60. The weighted average was about 61. Now, you got your benefits at 65, If you died at 61, and those are the people who were born in 1935, okay, the math worked out really well. Average lifespan in this country right now is going on 80. Okay, I think it's 77 for men, 78 for women, somewhere in that range. Okay, why is it? It's not like we're all working in the mines and the mills anymore. Okay, why is it we have a right to somebody else's money because we had a birthday, and that birthday made us turn 65? Well, because that was the deal. That's right, it was the deal. But the deal was never real. If you look at the rioting, or not rioting, but the protests going on with the unions in Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, there was a deal that was promised. And if I was one of those union people, I'd be pretty upset that you changed the deal on me. I did my part, okay? You said, do this and I'll give you this. I did this. Now you're saying you're not going to give me this. I would be upset. But the reality is there isn't any money to do what was promised. It was always a lie. Eventually, the math was going to catch up to you. The math is catching up to us. And we can either deal with this now as responsible adults, or we can wait for this whole thing to collapse and let someone impose this on us. And we can dump it all on our children. Those, unfortunately, become the only choices. Increase the amount of immigration we have. Oh, Ken, they'll take our jobs. No, that's not how this works. Okay, it's not a fixed pie. You bring more people in, productive people, okay, people who want to work, this is great. You want to solve the housing problem. Someone moves to this country, buy a house at market price, whatever it may be. Don't go on government assistance basically for 5 years, make your house payments for 5 years. I'll give you citizenship. What have I just done? I brought productive people into the country. I've reduced my supply of houses. I've got people who can pay their bills, paying taxes. I've got more people pulling the cart. I got productive people. It doesn't mean that you have to have open borders or whatever, although I'm generally not. You've got to know who's here, okay? And you don't want people coming here just to come in and get benefits, but that's not most people coming here. People come here because they want opportunity and they want to work. If we bring those kind of people in, we're going to have more people pulling the cart. You can radically cut the size of government. And radically, I'm talking about you just get the government out of a bunch of businesses. Something I learned as a consultant many years ago. If you've got a company that you need to turn around, you don't cut everything 10%. You just stop doing 50% of what you're doing right now. You may spend more money on the stuff that you keep doing because that's kind of what you have to do. Okay? What we're doing, there's no way we're going to radically cut the size of government. When I say radically, I'm talking 30, 40, 50%. Why is the government in the education business? Why is the government in the energy business? Why is it in the healthcare business? There's no value added there. And the idea that the government will make better decisions than the private sector is fundamentally flawed. And if you want to make the argument that, well, we had all of these problems with free market capitalism, no, you didn't. Okay? The reason you had a housing bubble is because the Federal Reserve created a whole bunch of cheap money, because the Community Reinvestment Act forced people to loan money to people who couldn't pay them back, and a whole series of other reasons. If the government had not been involved, you would not have had the depth of the crisis you had, because people would have had to take responsibility for their own decisions instead of passing it off to someone else. Now here's the reality. Some of you watching this, a few of you are thinking, yeah, this makes sense. Most of you are thinking I'm totally insane at this point. Here's the thing. Okay, this, I believe with all my heart, is accurate. I can be wrong. I certainly understand that. But you can't provide any evidence that another solution is going to work any more than I can convince you that this is going to work. And that's why this is never going to happen. Okay? None of these things are ever going to get done, because people won't want this to be the answer, even if it is the answer. And there is not enough data that you'll ever be able to convince anybody of another point of view. I mean, I've had in lectures people give me what I thought were incredibly crazy ideas. Okay? One of the ideas I heard one time is we should basically seize all of Apple's money. Okay, and if we do that, we're going to solve the problems. Well, one, it's not nearly enough money. Two, Apple provides a lot more value, or they wouldn't be. It's a ludicrous answer from my perspective. But you know what? Maybe that person's right. They will never convince me of that. And I will never convince that person that this is right. And this is why fundamentally we are in real trouble. Because there are those of us who believe that government is much more the problem than the solution. There are people who believe that there has to be fundamental fairness and social justice. And the two of us will never get on the same page. And that is why ultimately we will continue to march down a road that will destroy the value of everything that you own that's denominated in dollars. And why it is so important, again, that you learn how to protect yourself in that type of environment. Because what we're going to do instead of this is this. What's next? Quantitative easing.